Hey everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Skin Hue, a monthly YouTube series where we get together to talk openly and honestly about what it takes to have an elevated skin health and wellness lifestyle while also demystifying the healthcare system. Today, we're going to talk about all things telehealth or telemedicine. What is telemedicine? How do we evaluate when we're receiving the best care? And also dive deep into privacy and also how insurance works. We're going to have this conversation with Meg Barron, who serves as the Vice President of Digital Health Strategy for the American Medical Association. So let's get to it. Hi, Meg. Welcome to Skin Hue.
Hey, Sheena, how are you? Great to connect.
I'm doing good. Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you're able to join me today. I think this is going to be a really great conversation because we're diving into a topic that is on the top of everyone's mind right now, which is telehealth, digital health, telemedicine, and we'll get to all those terms. But before we want to jump into that, I would love to hear more about your background because you have a background in operations and startups and healthcare. So how did you, put all this background together and end up at the American Medical Association?
Yeah, great question. And thanks so much for having me today. I'm currently Vice President of Digital Health Strategy and Innovations at the AMA. And for those first not familiar with the AMA is the largest medical association representing physicians in all states and all specialties and really across all walks of life, really with the purpose of being a powerful ally for care overall for physicians and patients. And my path to get here, I started my career actually at Smith Buckland Corporation, which is the world's largest association management company. So it's run more as an agency. It can be anything from you would use their services for something more ad hoc, like just marketing or technology or operations, or full service and across all industry sectors. So started my career with business and healthcare clients, and then went over to Capgemini, which is a global consulting firm, and was doing more marketing and really business development for large consumer product goods company at the time. Got an interest, and both of my parents were had their own small businesses and were more entrepreneurial and have a background in family and that. So I was really one of the first to go into more traditional, corporate organizational roles. But, find myself, of course, kind of bringing that background to a lot of the work that I do and got involved in the Chicago entrepreneurial, incubator and accelerator scene when that was getting up and off the ground. But I say that because I moved over to AMA. This was 12 years ago, and it's felt, like I would say 4 different roles or 4 different organizations, I should say, because I've had 4 different plus roles during my time here that started in more marketing and product development space, and then pivoted and really transferred into some net new positions in portfolio management. And that's where I found myself back at the merchandise mart, for those familiar with Matter in 1871, and the accelerator spaces there, because we ended up having a presence. AMA ended up having a presence at Matter when that was getting up and off the ground. And our goal with that is to help ensure that physician and patient voices, and really a diverse representation of physician and patient voices, are getting represented. Our strategy is really focused on, in the digital health capacity, how do we help to ensure quality for digital health solutions and technology, and acceleration and scale for those solutions in market where they are proving to be evidence-based and trusted.
Awesome. So that's a really interesting background. It seems like your background was the perfect leeway into what you're doing now. And it's really about, it seems like the future of healthcare. So from where you sit in your experience, what does the future of healthcare look like? And I should probably step back and ask that previous question is, what is the future of healthcare for those who don't understand? And then what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's an amazing question. And, of course, no one has a crystal ball, but I think we're at this really interesting inflection point, just given the massive, expansion and really adoption of digital health, like especially during the pandemic, and the necessity of digital health to step up to the plate and really get pushed mainstream. As a bit of background, AMA, and when I started in the role of digital health at AMA, we started some baseline research that's really proven to be a really good benchmark of where we were and where we're going. But 6 years ago, we did our first digital health national research, which looked at from a physician's perspective. So we surveyed 1,300 physicians all across the country, different practice settings, different specialty types, different age ranges. And we wanted to get a sense of EHRs aside. So those is table stakes, right?
Right.
What physicians were using, what they were enthusiastic about, and then what their key requirements for adoption were. We repeated this in 2019 and released the results just a month before COVID. So it was already really interesting to see some shifts and really advancements in terms of adoption, specifically for telehealth and virtual care and for remote patient monitoring. So for instance, in 2016, like 14% of physicians said they were using virtual care in any capacity. And then in 2019, which again, we released the results in 2020, that had doubled. So they were using 28%, they'd use it in some capacity. Likely not a lot at that time, but still like in some capacity, they had said that they were using it. So we're going to repeat that research this year, and it'll be very interesting to see, right, both the shifts in, of course, adoption, right, but where do we go from here in terms of receptivity to even new emerging technologies or solution types like digital therapeutics or other areas. What I will say, and what's been really helpful from that research, is it's been really foundational to our strategy. Because we got at what physicians' key requirements for adoption are, which really fall into 4 key buckets around: prove to me it works and has an evidence base, right? Prove to me that there's a fair reimbursement pathway if I use this. And that's, again, an area where the pandemic really helped to open the door for adoption for telehealth. The third is around liability coverage. So is this safe? From a privacy and security component, and can I feel safe using this with my patients? And then the fourth, which, can often be the most difficult, is will this work and integrate into my workflow? And/or can this help me reimagine my workflow so that I can save some time or have more face time with my patient, which is what I really ultimately want to do. And FaceTime, be it virtually or in person, right? So in a nutshell, where do I see the future going? I think it's finding that secret sauce of virtual and in-person care that's based on clinical appropriateness, that's based on patient and physician, both expectations and also preferences, right? And I think that's the, again, puzzle pieces that need to come together in the coming year and more.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I do believe that telemedicine allows for the physician to have more time that they can spend in the treatment room with the patient, but also maybe even, reviewing charts and spending a little bit more time and going double back, and just checking up on their patients, which I feel will build more trust and community, right? So then you're going to have more people willing to go to the doctor, and you're not have to drag them to the doctor. So I think that's spot on. And also we just mentioned in the course of our conversation using telemedicine with digital health, like interchangeably. So for myself, it's kind of like I view telemedicine a part of digital health. Some people think it's totally different, but it's also, I think there needs to be this line drawn between digital health, where it's education, and then getting people to understand the difference what telemedicine is, where you're actually doing a visit. Do you find like there needs to be like that type of?
We've had so many conversations about this, and even dating back again, I think in 2016 when we were doing this national digital health research, and If anyone Googles AMA digital health research, you'll see how we defined it. And we've repeated that definition for 2019, but even are going to be taking a fresh look at that for this latest research we'll be doing this year and expect to have out in the fallish timeframe. But it is interesting because, routinely I'll hear, and sometimes we will often speak to it this way, is kind of digital health is the broader like umbrella for all. Then you'll hear digital medicine being like spoke about, and then kind of a smaller subset of digital therapeutics. Similarly for, telemedicine and telehealth that often get used interchangeably as well. And, it's our definitions. And if you go to our website and see how we're defining digital health in comparison to telemedicine, in comparison to telehealth, a lot of that even gets down to how CMS is defining telemedicine, and even that from like a reimbursement perspective and all. So it is complex. I'd say that I would foresee that the lines are slowly starting to get further kind of categorized like naturally based on what's what's starting to work. See Rock Health like reports and like the amount of digital health to additional just M&A and consolidation in the market of, again, what's working, and back to those physicians' key requirements and questions that need to be met. Those that are going to net out and those that are going to be the most useful are those that are going to be able to meet those key requirements, both from a physician and patient perspective. Absolutely. So complex, but I think my hope is it will start to get more clear focus, right, as kind of the use cases yield out.
Exactly. And speaking of use cases and coupling with what we talked about before of telemedicine not replacing in-person visits, I want to take it a step further, right? When we start to talk about underserved communities, and particularly what this show is about, better serving Black and Brown women. I really think that telemedicine in and of itself, how it's used, can start to close some of these health equity gaps, right? So whether that's literacy or frustration or even fear sometimes. So do you all talk about that at the AMA, or, how do you all see that?
It's a massive, conversation as part of our telehealth strategy and our advocacy team, which is focused on ensuring that this, really access for telehealth remains. And we've done some research that's looked at both the patient and physician perspective this year around both preferences, but also how telehealth is getting utilized. And it was interesting because, historically, telehealth just hasn't been something that you've accessed through your primary care provider, right? Like it was through like a third party system, which at times could create more fragmentation of care, kind of keep that continuity of care between a patient and a provider, together, right? And very solid. Now, with the access that's been created from just allowances through the pandemic and all, we're seeing very different circumstances and outcomes like prevail, which is great. But again, we need those allowances to stick long term so people can make strategic investments at both the small practice all the way to the large health system perspective. But the one thing for the research, we found that when patients were given the option to see their existing provider, and this assumes they have an existing PCP, right? And we know that there's a large portion of the population that don't, to where other service offerings can be extremely helpful to help for just access to care into this general system, right? And then figure out where in-person care is needed, the blending of in-person and virtual care. The other thing I'd love to mention is we've done some research this year we've turned return on health research. And really what this is getting at is how do we measure the value of virtual care and move that beyond just the kind of return on investment piece of it, but look at the value that's being created more holistically around patient access, around health equity is one of our 6 value streams, around patient and physician really satisfaction and experience, and then of course, clinical outcomes. So we have included case studies from all different practice settings in this research. And then we've been collecting outcomes data and those 6 value streams. So health equity, clinical outcomes, patient physician satisfaction, and of course, still financial outcomes, and attempting to better aggregate that, both at the individual like practice setting so that that can get used to help inform additional investment for virtual care. And again, a more holistic picture, but also at an aggregate level from an advocacy standpoint to say, okay, well, you can't look at this from just this lens right now. You have to look at the big picture and why this access needs to remain.
Absolutely. And to add to that, I will also want to throw in there more of like the policy aspect of it, right?
Yep.
Start talking about the ability for doctors to practice across state lines. And just in my work, a lot of patients don't realize that your doctor has to be licensed in a particular state. So when you're on a telemedicine platform and they say, oh, we're not in your state yet, like there's legal reasons why they're not. So I would love to like put that in there. I'm probably, just piggybacking off of my own background working on Capitol Hill and how policies work. But I would definitely like to see that move forward too, right? We got a little bit of it during the pandemic, but like, how do we build upon that to really like expand access to care? So maybe you're just not in a state that has a specialist. I don't know, like, something like that. And you can see that person.
That's incredibly important. And we work closely with our state advocacy colleagues who have helped to lead us and work with a lot of the state associations for like an interstate license compact, which is helping to allow for licensing to happen much more rapidly, right? Like where there are instances of this, but you're right, it's incredibly important right now.
And so one other thing I want to talk about on telemedicine platforms is a question I get a lot from women that I talk to is about privacy and understanding how their data is being used. And then also wanting to know why a lot of companies aren't really proactive about sharing, their privacy policies and making it more of an education effort and like a group effort, right?
Yeah, this is very important. And, again, I don't have the magic bullet for this. I think it's definitely very robust right now. But I will say that, again, I give a lot of kudos to my advocacy colleagues who have actually put out, it's a playbook of sorts for patient access and related to patient access, electronic access, like playbook. So really what this is for more, the target audience is providers and practices to be able to utilize to make sure that they're following the right, like really protocols as it relates to patient data, and really starts to help dispel like HIPAA myths and helping, again, physicians better understand both their obligations to provide patients with access to their health information, which is incredibly important, but also just help to demystify, I think, this space a bit more, right? And have some, again, very clear communication lines as it relates to that. I'd say on the flip side, as it relates to the vendor community, this is the area I've been closer to, where AMA was one of the founding members of a group called Exertia, which was focused on and is focused on developing guiding principles in the areas of privacy, security, clinical efficacy, operability, and usability for vendors to use to make sure that they're following like correct protocols or kind of a playbook of sorts of what should be table stakes, right, for what they are putting out. And so, unfortunately, so much of it does fall on the individual patient to be savvy right now in terms of what you are agreeing to and all. But my hope is that that is going to improve in terms of the expectations on, both the vendor community and really just the industry as a whole, which I do feel like is moving in the right direction. But still a long way to go.
Definitely. I think we're going to get there. And I think, from coming from the startup world and speaking to other, healthcare tech founders, we are having conversations about how do we go the extra mile, right? Because there's a benefit to being 100% transparent about like, this is the information we're collecting. This is how we store it. This is how we encrypt it. Mm-hmm. And we may get requests from other types of entities wanting to have access to the information that we have. And this is how you scrub it. This is how you remove personal identifiers from it. And I think if you're more, go to the concept of clinical trials, right? Like if you're upfront and honest about what it's about, you're going to get more people willing to be on your platform and talk to you.
Yeah. And it's back to trust, right? I mean, like I would like to naively think that no company would want to enter into a situation where they want to break trust, right, with their customers. But of course, we see that happen time and time and time again, right? If it doesn't, exactly what you were saying, if there's not transparency and if that's not kind of baked into your ethos of sorts from the front.
Yeah. And so just to tie it up in a nice little bow, what we're talking about transparency for our conversation today, like what are some good tips that you would give for a woman who's watching this show or listening to the podcast about how to evaluate a telemedicine platform, but how when you walk away from that visit, because it might be a little bit different than your in-person visit, how do you evaluate that I actually had a good visit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, while the Exertia guidance is obviously meant more for the vendor community to be able to assess, I feel like even for patients, though, it's some great like overview info of even what you should be thinking about in terms of expectations of any vendor / kind of technology company that you are thinking of wanting to utilize, right? Like overall. I think a great other starting point, and this is, again, it has assumptions to it, that if you do have an existing, primary care, like physician or provider that you've worked with, taking a fresh look at what technology services or offerings that they do now have that even maybe a year ago or 2 years ago that they did not offer, and attempting to try out that experience, right? If that potentially before of like making a visit, going to find a parking spot, going to like take time off work was really keeping you from accessing care. And I think it's such a personal thing, right? Like you have to know, and it's similar to so many things in life of like, it when you find it, right? Like that, exactly. Unfortunately that it's going to be slightly different for everyone. But I think that good or bad, there's just so many options out there right now, which again can be a blessing and a curse. And I think all the more reason why having some guidance out there can be helpful. The other resource I'd mentioned that we have is something called a telehealth implementation playbook. And while the audience for this is not directly patients, but it's more so it's meant for physicians and practices and health systems who are attempting to evaluate vendors, new telehealth vendors, as well as kind of going through the process and really even moving beyond adoption, because most have adopted telehealth in some capacity at this point, but more so focusing on optimization of telehealth like into their environments. And also from the selection standpoint, many stood up whatever they could, right? Like at the time during the pandemic, just to ensure that they had access to care to their patients. Now people are taking a step back and being like, all right, well, what's my long-term plan or my long-term strategy, right, for virtual care? What's working well, what's not? And I think back to even, I'll use an example. Like I've been previously living in like rural Michigan, where we couldn't get internet, like broadband internet, to like save our lives, like for a while, right? Like, and so that access to audio only, like telehealth, is again something AMA is continuing to very much advocate for, because it just has to take into consideration that not everyone, even though it's 2020, of course, like has access to broadband internet right now. And from an equity perspective, that has to remain on the table.
Exactly. I think that's a good ending point. And I like that you shared those resources. So now someone can say, I'm interested in telehealth, like these are all these services, this is how I can pick the service, but then, formulating questions, whether they write them down or they just have them in their head. So they're able to evaluate that conversation with the doctor. Are they still responsive?
Yep.
Are they being dismissive? And hopefully, when it comes to women, and we know there's an issue with gaslighting, that maybe more women on a telehealth platform could feel more comfortable advocating for themselves, right?
Exactly.
And it's a lot
sure.
easier not to go back to that service.
Yeah.
I could find something else versus like, this may be the only doctor in a 50, 100
finding the right fit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for joining me on this show today. And I believe everyone is going to be able to walk away with resources that they now can go and get the right telemedicine care, but more importantly, the right care that's perfect for them.
Yeah. No, thanks so much, Sheena. It was really, really nice to meet and look forward to reconnecting soon.
Absolutely.